Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. In today's episode, I had the privilege of talking with Dr. Reggie Williams, author of Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. Now, I think this is a really important work because it does something that so often gets overlooked when we have these heroes of the faith or heroes of the nation or whatever, these people who make monumental decisions that happen in a moment but don't come from just a moment. They come from formation over a long period of time. As a cheesy analogy, thinking of a diamond, right, that you see worn on somebody's finger or around somebody's neck, and it's beautiful, but that diamond, the formation of it, to get to the point where you see that glimmer of light reflected off of it, I mean, that moment of beauty is really brought to you by many, many, many lifetimes, years, decades, millennia of formation in seemingly trivial moments of pressure and darkness, right? Well, the same thing is true of people. The monumental decisions that we see people make are done in a moment, but they come from a lifetime of formation. And that is no less true with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This thing that we praise him for, his stand against the Nazis, was just a fraction of his life. If you take his whole stand, it's about a quarter of his life, which is significant. But even in the war years, when Bonhoeffer was making his stand, most of the moments that he experienced were moments with family and students and fellow disciples of Jesus, laughing, playing the piano, conversing, planning, all kinds of things. And those are the things that shaped Dietrich Bonhoeffer to be able to make those decisions in a moment which we now remember him for. What Dr. Williams is going to argue in his book, and what we're going to discuss here a little bit today, is one of the very formative times in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life. His time in New York City, not just Union Theological Seminary, because he was actually not too fond of that and had some issues with some of their solely social gospel focus and the lack of theological rigor, but his time in Harlem, his interaction with the Black church and the Black community, which was transformational in his life. Bonhoeffer came over to New York City, somewhat nationalistic, or at least with a strong emphasis on his own people, with somewhat limited experiences, and from a family who was fairly aristocratic, fairly well off. So his time in New York City, particularly in the Black church, where he was able to experience a diversity that he had never really experienced before, and where he was able to experience, or at least see firsthand, the abuse and the oppression of other people, his brothers and sisters in Christ. I mean, that transformed Dietrich Bonhoeffer. In the next couple episodes, we are going to take a look at how Dietrich Bonhoeffer was able to fight off the Nazi propaganda, how he was able to cling to truth and see through a lot of just the terrible ideology that came from the Nazis and from nationalism. But that ability to see through that is going to start here, or at least be significantly formed here in Harlem, where Dietrich Bonhoeffer was discipled. Because as I argued in my discipleship season, it is discipleship which gives us a vision to see. And that can either give us a vision to see what we're indoctrinated with, or it can give us a vision to see truth. And here in Harlem, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was exposed to the true reality of the world, the reality of oppression and evil that exists, but also the reality of the cross, the reality of Jesus present with us, and how we as his community were to be with one another and be the hands and feet of Jesus. And that is going to enable Bonhoeffer, when he gets back, to seek to disciple others and continue to be discipled by what he learned and by the Jesus who is seen in the Sermon on the Mount. This Jesus who is not always easy to follow because he's idealistic. He has these ideals and he demands no compromises. But he is also a Jesus who never leaves us or forsakes us. He is always with us. So hopefully you enjoy this discussion with Dr. Reggie Williams today, and hopefully you go and pick up his book because he gets into a whole lot more than I get into here. Also, check the show notes because Dr. Williams has he was a huge contributor to a documentary on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he has provided some ways that we can access that material because it's not quite out yet. So if you go to the links in the show notes, you can find some of Dr. Williams' other interviews and discussions on YouTube, but also you can get access to this documentary on Bonhoeffer. So I think that's all. Without further ado, here is the discussion with Dr. Reggie Williams. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for being willing to chat with me. I've been looking forward to this as I was finishing your book, and it's always really exciting to me to be able to talk with the people that I'm reading from, because as much as you write down and as much work as you put into it, there are always so many questions that are yet to be answered. So hopefully we can get to a couple of those things today. But first, I would love for you to introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to study Bonhoeffer.
Sure. Nice to meet you. Good to be with you and your listening community. My name is Reggie Williams, and I'm an associate professor of theology at St. Louis University in the city of St. Louis. This is my first semester out here in St. Louis, actually. I've just moved here from Chicago, Illinois, where I was a professor of Christian ethics for the past 12 years. And before that, a year at Baylor University as a Christian ethicist. And before that, I was in Pasadena, California, where I was finishing my degree. In Pasadena, I came to the study of Bonhoeffer because my mentor, Glenn Stassen, made quite a number of Bonhoeffer scholars. He was very interested in and actually a mentee of Dietrich Bonhoeffer posthumously, mentored by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer was very important to him. And he just passed on that love of Bonhoeffer. So that's how that happened. I came to Bonhoeffer studies in my first year of a PhD program. Back in, I want to say, when was that? It took me 4 years to do my degree. It was maybe 2006 or 2006, 2007, something like that, when I first met Bonhoeffer. Actually first started studying him intensively, but I encountered him as an undergrad, much longer ago than that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've really liked about your book, the perspective that you're able to kind of bring to it, is that you really focus on a part of Bonhoeffer's life that I feel you don't get from too many other sources. There are a lot of other sources that kind of they touch on his time in the States, and particularly in Harlem, but they don't really frame that as a pivotal time so much. It's just kind of part of what Bonhoeffer, part of his story. And I don't know, have you seen the new movie by any chance?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I thought they put a pretty significant amount of time into that, which I thought was great. But essentially, your line of argumentation seems to be that Bonhoeffer's experience in 1930 Harlem, it wasn't just kind of the next step for him, but it was something that was really transformative. And I think before we get into the argumentation of your book, I think what would really be helpful is in order to see that somebody's transformed, you kind of have to know where they came from. Would you be able to give us just a brief background of who Dietrich Bonhoeffer was when he arrived in Harlem, in New York City at Union Theological? What was he like before the transformation?
Sure. That's a great question. Let me begin by saying something to the effect of why that kind of engagement with Bonhoeffer is missed often in the academy. In theological studies, even in our society between Christian communities, things get compartmentalized very easily, very commonly. In fact, they're put in their spaces like a TV dinner in the academy. The peas don't touch the carrots unless they're mixed together intentionally, but the certainly don't touch the steak with its gravy in the tray that it's in. And that's the same way things are in the academy. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is theological thought, German theological thought, and he resides within the classics. But what I have done is taken a look at Black theology, which is the language of Black church. And these spaces, that kind of engagement tends to be with on the recommended reading lists in your theology class, if it shows up there at all. But life is not so easily compartmentalized. His life demonstrates that. He's going to have engagements with different communities, which he did. And this engagement, this crossover between German Theological Academy and a Black church theological academy, if you may call it theological academy at that time, it wasn't in the academy, but it's Black church theological outlook. The social gospel is really what it was. The Black social gospel is where he was moving in and out of, and it had an impact on him. So before he came to the United States, to answer your question, he's one of 8 kids in a very, very wealthy family. A father that's a professor, a psychology professor at the University of Berlin. He's in charge of the Charité Hospital, which is the psychiatric wing of the hospital that's connected to the university. I believe that's. But he's the head of the Charité Hospital there in Berlin, psychology wing of it. And they've got lots of money. They've got, people who manage the meals and cleaning and so forth. And mom did some of the homeschooling. He was homeschooled, but he and his twin sister Sabine and their youngest sister Susanna were homeschooled for a bit, but ended up going to school as well outside of the home, whereas the earlier kids were all completely homeschooled. If I've got that right, that's he's the youngest of 4 boys, and his twin sister is the third of 4 girls. Born April 4th, 1906, into a big family, a very tight-knit family. Now, this is important because he is, in that makeup, the only one who studies theology. They're all very, very bright people, but they weren't raised going to church, and they weren't a church-going family, period. Theirs is a Christianity that was commonly practiced by the upper middle class in Germany. And that Christianity, some scholars describe as culture Protestantism, where one does not, regularly attend church, but you certainly get your, children baptized there, go through catechism and do weddings and funerals and so forth. His older brother, Walter, who was the second eldest brother, Carl Friedrich, Walter, then Klaus, then Dietrich. Walter is killed during World War I. From 1914 to 1918, the country was embroiled in a war, the World War I, of course. And Carl Friedrich and Walter went off to fight for Germany. Carl Friedrich came back wounded. Walter was killed. An infection that set in as some shrapnel from a bomb that killed a couple of people in his unit. That death of Walter devastated the family, as you might imagine. To have a sibling die in a tight-knit family was devastating. It changed everybody, really. And it's that moment that Dietrich decided he wanted to study theology, the language of the church, thinking about the afterlife and so forth. That's what changed him at age 13 to become a theologian. And he was a very brilliant kid who stayed on that focus for the rest of his life. And he is trained as a theologian in the period between World War I and World War II, deciding that he wants to be a theologian at age 13, but a year after World War I ends. Goes to Tübingen for a portion of undergrad, finishes that degree, undergrad and PhD at what is now Humboldt University. Friedrich Wilhelm became Humboldt University. And in that period of time, Germany is suffering from quite a number of things related to the war. Rampant inflation, there's hunger. He describes eating bread made from sawdust and flour. This is a wealthy family. Imagine what the middle class and the poor were feeling. People wearing clothes made of paper and cloth, in addition to the what will be the Great Depression that hits in 1930. Allies had placed an embargo on the country after 1919. I mean, during the war. They placed an embargo there that didn't allow some goods to come into the country, so they were really struggling. And it's in this period that he is developing his theology, learning, becoming a theologian in the after-war World War I period, thinking about the fall of their country, thinking about war losses and the death that has made its way into nearly everyone's house, missing the earlier periods of a great country and of a close-knit family. He heads to Barcelona, Spain, after he completes his dissertation. He's a vicariate, you might say, somewhat of an associate pastor for an expatriate congregation in Barcelona, Spain. And you can hear some of this longing in him there, where he preaches about 20 sermons or so and does 3 academic lectures, one of them called Basic Questions of a Christian Ethic. You hear this longing in him, talking about being, his allegiance to his people, to his folk, which is a very common German theme at that time, folkishness. It's an ethnic pride, sort of, and the revitalization of his people and fighting for his people. Love for his people can sanctify murder, can sanctify war, these grandiose terms. And in that longing for pre-war greatness, there's also some melancholy, some malaise. He would like to have a theology that matters for daily life. The church to have a response to the suffering that people are going through, the hunger, the hopelessness. Does the church speak in any way to these things? Academic theology doesn't have the answers for him as he's currently contrived it, as he's currently experienced it. He finishes his it's called a habilitation in Germany that qualifies one for teaching at the university. We describe it as something of a second dissertation. We don't have that requirement in the States. Germany is requirement. Finishes his habilitation at age 24. Dissertation completed at age 21. The habilitation at age 24. Inaugural lecture. The title is called, he gets the title private docent, which means he's finished his habilitation. But he's too young to be ordained in the church. He had to be 25 for that. But he qualifies to be a professor with his habilitation done. But he's dissatisfied with how he's understanding Christianity at the moment, specifically how the church speaks to daily troubles and problems. The man in charge of his dissertation process, Max Diestel, wants him to go and look around the world a bit, describes him as ruddy, young, wants him to work on his English. They decide that he decides that the United States is where he'd go. He considered England. The United States is where he'd go. And for Bonhoeffer, New York is where he chooses, not Harvard, not Princeton, Yale, any of these kinds of schools. His brother had done some work at Harvard, and they offered him a position. Because eldest brother offered him a faculty position at Harvard. He chose not to do that. But that was all on the table for him, of course. Settles on Union in New York. Union is a bigger place for learning. New York is a bigger place for learning than the seminary. And that's when he goes to New York looking for, as he describes it, a cloud of witnesses for the struggle and the complexity that he's experiencing in Germany. That's when he arrives in the fall of 1930 as what's called a Sloan Fellow. They had developed a fellowship for 3 European students there, where they would usually come and get a Bachelor of Divinity, which is our equivalent of a Master's of Divinity today, after 1 year of study and head back to their home country. Well, there's a German one, a Swiss one, and a French one in Bonhoeffer's year. The German one already had a dissertation and habilitationship done. He didn't need more study, but he comes there to investigate, looking for something. And that's the condition we find him in at age 24 in the fall of 1930 at Union Seminary.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It was really interesting to me that Bonhoeffer came from, I don't know if you'd consider it aristocracy, but a well-off family, and that he talked so much about this the Volk that he was talking about, because when I got towards the end of your book, one of the quotes that I think kind of frames everything for me was a quote that I hadn't seen from all the other stuff that I had read from Bonhoeffer, but it kind of struck me as representative. And in it, Bonhoeffer says, he basically talks about how there was the proletariat Jesus, and he thought that the proletariat Jesus uh, wouldn't exist because the bourgeois Jesus had kind of kicked him out of the churches and taken over the churches as seats of power. And Bonhoeffer says, quote, "When the proletariat says that Jesus is a good human being, it means more than the bourgeoisie means when it says that Jesus is God. Jesus is present in the factory halls as a worker among workers. He stands beside members of the proletariat as a fighter in their ranks against the capitalist enemy," end quote. And so I think that's really powerful to me, because it encapsulates what I think you're arguing that Bonhoeffer learned in Harlem, that there is a Jesus who can't be found in academia, but can only be found on the streets. And like that right there just encapsulates what I envision as Bonhoeffer's transformation. So I would love for you to explain, when you've got Bonhoeffer, this young seeker, this green theologian, not like, he's very bright, but he's not worldly wise yet per se. How does he get from that questioning kid in 1930 to saying this only 3 years later, in his Christology lectures?
Yeah, I love that quote. I was so moved when I came across that while I was studying years ago. Um, so first, yeah, he is aristocracy. His mother is aristocracy. Paula von Hayes comes from German aristocracy, but his father is among the Bildungsbürgertum, which is the upper middle class, educated upper middle class. They see themselves as responsible for the maintenance of German culture and society by way of education and the arts, specifically. Things of that matter. They're not among the working class. They're upper middle class, wealthy upper middle class. But mom is aristocracy, so Bonhoeffer is among German aristocracy. And he understood, as he said, that Black Christianity in the United States is the only real, what he's described as proletariat Christianity, working people. And the meaning of that quote, as I understand him, is not that the bourgeois are equated with so much the intellectual or the academy, but the bourgeois connected with the cultural Protestantism, the upper elite of society, who are fine with saying, who are fine with abstract concepts, abstract notions of God that don't touch the ground in everyday living. But among the one of the things that he was looking for in his cloud of witnesses were a people whose whole bodies were under the gospel, the claims and the demands of the gospel. Not these people who can compartmentalize Christ, part of culture, but not in the day-to-day of my engagements with my neighbor, and the mundane things of life. Later, in the Christology lectures that go by the title Christ the Center, he's speaking of Christ at the center of our existence. Later in the prison, when he's in prison, he's talking about religionless Christianity in a world come of age, Christ who's not pushed to the margins of society, but that's at the center of our daily existence. How do you recognize Christ in the daily encounter with your neighbor and with all of your ongoing, existence, where your whole being and all of your life are under the demands of the gospel? That's not abstract. To say that Jesus is a good man is to recognize that person in the day-to-day of my existence. It's a proximity argument.
So in Harlem, you would say that Bonhoeffer perhaps experienced the proximity of Jesus.
Absolutely.
And could you put that in a tangible, like maybe an example, or like how did he experience that differently?
In that chapter, I'll do it in this way. In the chapter where I'm speaking that quote, I quote a scholar whom I have a great deal of respect for, a Black woman, Jackie Grant, who talks about how Black women liberate Jesus from the boxes that white theologians have placed him in. To say things like, God is masculine only, the gender box, misses how women and Black women specifically recognize him in their lives and their day-to-day existence. To say that Jesus is identified or can be identified by wealthy folks misses the recognition of Jesus amongst the poor, and Jesus as white does not recognize the association that Black people have had with him throughout history. So how do people who find themselves under the burden of legalized harm, of financial exploitation, of racial, marginalization, how do they understand the presence of God with them and for them in your average white middle-class evangelical congregation in the United States that may be much more attuned to speaking about life after death and personal piety rather than the day-to-day legal political structures that place restrictions on your life? This is the question that Bonhoeffer, one of the questions that he's getting at. It makes it very easy to compartmentalize one's faith for like moral issues or life after death, and not recognize the need that people have for praying for freedom to walk to a grocery store without being harmed, to know where their next meal is coming from, to get up in the day and not be and think about the possibilities that something could be coming their way that would have legal sanction, but physical harm. What would it mean if in Germany, when they had to eat bread mixed with sawdust and flour, they knew how to rely on God for their daily bread and not see that as a social issue, not a gospel issue, which was very common for Lutheran. When he, this is another very concrete example that he faced. While he was in the United States, the case of the Scottsboro Nine was gaining international acclaim. These are 9 Black young men on a train in Alabama. Only, I think, 3 or 4 of them actually knew each other before this happened. But on the train, there was an altercation with, they're in a boxcar. There's an altercation with a couple of white men, young men, between some of the black teens, really, on the train. And those white young men got off at a stop. And they made some accusations because of that altercation. They made some local accusations with law enforcement about these Black boys on the train having their way with some white girls. That's the accusation historically in the United States that's sent white mobs after Black people, lynching Black men in droves, and by the thousands, actually, in the United States. So at another stop, there were people there waiting for them. To make a long story short, these young men who didn't know each other beforehand were sentenced to death, rushed through trial and sentenced to death for raping a white woman. Everybody around saw how foolish and unjust that was. Dietrich hears about that in that year, writes back home, because the churches are praying about it. The NAACP is very involved in it, especially the churches that he's at, the church that he's at, Abyssinian Baptist, writes home for them to join in the international furor over what's happened here. Gets a letter back. That's a social issue. It's not a gospel issue. And the church is to be involved in in gospel matters only, not legal and social matters. It does not place the entire being of one's existence under the gospel. So unfortunate for those young men, if they want to pray if they want somebody to pray for their soul or something like that, then yeah, but their legal existence, their life, their possibility for flourishing now, that's not a church concern. The way that society is structured for the well-being of some and the harm of others on the day-to-day basis, these are the things that he was concerned about. And later, when he got back from New York, he's asking questions like, does the church have the ability to say something that Christians must do in their daily lives? Are there commandments? Does the Sermon on the Mount speak to the daily existence of people?
Yeah, I think that word compartmentalization that you used, that actually, when you said it, that ties in with 2 of the other questions that I have for you. I think it's a really big theme in Christendom as a whole. I think it's a human tendency, but one of the places that you bring it up quite a bit is when you talk about what is it, the theology of the cross and the theology of glory. And there's that compartmentalization there, or you talk about it. I forget the 2 words you use. I don't know if it's eschatological or apocalyptic, but where you have the view of like triumph at the end versus the view of the temporal, the here and now. Um, so one of the things that stands out to me, going back to the theology of the cross and theology of glory, is that one of the things it seems Bonhoeffer learned in Harlem was suffering, the theology of cross. And what's really fascinating to me is that, a lot of populists like Hitler or modern day populists, they tend to meet the masses where they are, like in the beer halls, right? Hitler was very famous for meeting the hoi polloi, the everyday people. He would go to the beer halls, and in fact, they had the beer hall putsch. They even name it after a beer hall because that's where Hitler was going.
Yeah.
So in a way, like Hitler and other populists, they try to deal with suffering people. They deal with the oppressed, but a lot of times what they do is they end up trying to find a scapegoat. They try to take this suffering and they find other victims to place that on. And that's very Girardian, mimetic. And you had a quote from Discipleship, which I think touches on the idea of suffering, where Bonhoeffer says, quote, "Suffering must be borne in order for it to pass." And I think what Hitler and populists did was they passed the suffering on to others so they don't have to bear it. But what Bonhoeffer had learned, presumably in Harlem, is that suffering under the theology of the cross meant that the Christ, but also by extension us, his body, the church, we were to bear up under suffering. And rather than pass our suffering on and victimizing other people, that we would suffer with and for the oppressed. So I would love for you to talk about the rich theology of suffering. I know James Cone and other people have talked about this as well, seeing Christ, in the lynching tree and everything. What did Bonhoeffer presumably learn? What can the Black community teach us? What did Harlem teach him in regard to suffering and theology of the cross and throwing off that compartmentalization?
Yeah. So one thing, first, suffering is not something to be celebrated. Bonhoeffer has this engagement with suffering that is one, it's something that he does encounter, and I think he learns from in Harlem. I think that's true from the Black church. But we see things through the lenses provided for us by our formation, and it's no different with him. For one perspective on suffering within Black theological, Black theological perspective on suffering is different than the way I would describe this, very different than what I've experienced with white churches, specifically even like evangelicalism, where suffering may be an indication of lack of faith. Suffering is an indication that something is not right for you. Um, and, the goal of the gospel in one's life is happiness, peace, joy, and well-being. Not a lot of room for brokenness. The connection with Christ is made in a faith-filled life where Christ makes things much, much, much better. Suffering is an indication of something wrong. Whereas at least one perspective within Black theological thought is that suffering is not an indication of something wrong for or with you. Suffering is an indication of the powers that be doing of fallen powers and principalities moving in upon one space. And that is what we see from this theological perspective with Christ. Christ is with those people for whom the principalities and powers have moved upon in a harmful way. Christ is with them in the workers' hall. Christ is with them in the noose and on the cross. The people who themselves are pushed out to the margins of society by oppressive powers and structures are there with Jesus. The song that I put in chapter 1, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" This is a perspective on suffering. I was there. We were all there. Now, what role did you play in that moment? Did you have hammer and nails? Were you on the side of principalities and powers? We recognize our connection with Christ there on the cross, who identifies with us. It's not something to be celebrated. It's something to be acknowledged, that we are recipients, like Simon of Cyrene, who picked up that cross, and when that black body touched that cross, black people picked up the suffering of Christ as well. He identifies with us, and is, as such, Sunday is coming. It's an interesting question that brings up, other corresponding questions of theodicy. You asked that question as well in earlier, but theodicy, it's interesting for, there are some who say that Black people aren't asking the questions of why, Lord. Anthony Penn, a scholar friend at Rice University in Texas, has a whole book titled Why, Lord, where he says that Black people are in fact asking these kinds of questions. But there is not a thoroughgoing, so far as I can see, thoroughgoing theology of the problem of evil, and a thoroughgoing engagement with the problem of evil. It's just a recognition that if God was with Christ on the cross, then God is with Black people in suffering, that there is that connection that's made there, and that we know that evil does not have the last word. One can hear something similar with Dietrich. I don't hear him asking the question, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? The question for Bonhoeffer is, who is Christ for us today? What is God's will? Standard question. He's not asking the question of theodicy so much. He's asking the question of obedience to God's present and ongoing existence, or our will for our lives.
Yeah, I think what you said, the part where you mentioned that suffering isn't to be celebrated, I think that's really important, and especially as somebody who comes from a position of nonviolence, you recognize that there's going to be a lot of suffering, and you're going to be on the side that does a lot of suffering, and that is not to be celebrated, but it's to be expected. And I think maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe what is celebrated in suffering is not the suffering, but the endurance of those who suffer, those who bear up and move forward. Would you say that that's accurate, or?
Maybe that it's to be that in suffering there is an acknowledgement that God is with us and hope is not lost. That the people who contribute to your suffering, who are part of that, though they may see themselves as having some authority, maybe even understood as God-given, they are wrong. That is the hope. God is with us. There's I don't hear much about it. The widow who gives all of her, the widow's mite, who gives all in the collection plate. It's at the temple. She's poor, impoverished. Who knows where she's going to get her next meal? She's given all that she has. And while others may recognize the wealthy for how much they have, and it's a celebration when they give, they are not suffering when they give. She suffered. And Christ acknowledged or saw her, whereas everyone else was seeing the others. Christ saw her. Jesus saw her in that moment and elevated her. That is the expectation of connecting with Christ in your situation. God is with you. God sees you. You are not lost on God.
Yeah.
Not that he celebrated her so much, but he certainly did acknowledge her, recognized her, and on the cross later, was in solidarity with her.
Yeah. One of the other questions that I had for you in regard to compartmentalization is, as I was reading through, it was fascinating but sad to me to hear that many of those who stood against the Nazis, I had assumed that Bonhoeffer, had this group of people, small group, but a group that stood up against the Nazis with him. And I think I'm reading you and some others at this point, I'm starting to realize that this group that resisted the Nazis was fairly diverse. You had a lot of different diverse theology. Their commonality was that they resisted the Nazis. And reading your book, one of the things that you wrote was, quote, the majority of Bonhoeffer's fellow resisting pastors were at odds with the Führer principle in the church, but not against Hitler's government, end quote. And so the way that I read that is essentially that these resistors, a lot of the resistors, along with Bonhoeffer, they didn't want the Nazis to encroach on their power structure inside the church. They didn't want to be imposed upon by the government in their domain. But they didn't so much mind what the government was doing in order to make Germany great again. Or like somebody like Niemöller, maybe he wasn't wild about it, but he went along with it um, for a bit. And so it's like they wanted power in both realms. They wanted to keep the power in their church, and they were okay with Germany getting more power because that helped them as well. Um, and so Bonhoeffer even questioned, you mentioned that he questioned whether he was on the right path because he said there are so many other people that he respected that were great, great people that just disagreed with him. And Bonhoeffer couldn't sign on with them when they didn't address the Jewish question. And so he felt even at odds with them at times. And that at least seems to me, not being inside the Black church myself, but as someone looking in, it seems to me, if I can try to put myself in their shoes, that after so many years, decades, centuries of hardship, of being at odds with the majority culture, with the broader culture, after continuing to experience hardship, it seems like Bonhoeffer was feeling dejected after a couple of years, after generations of this. How do you endure? And that's something that that I just can't wrap my mind around. So, do you think there's, with Bonhoeffer going inside of Harlem, do you think that the picture of endurance that they had, the picture of um, not resigned, I can't think of the word, but like determination to move forward. Did he learn anything about that in order for his resolve to continue on the path when he felt like nobody else was on the path with him?
There's a lot of moving parts in what you were just saying. Let me see here. Bonhoeffer's resolve. Let's hold that in tension for a moment, and go back for a second to what was happening in the confessing church movement, in the church struggle. For the Lutheran, the church is the right hand of God. The government is the left hand of God. There's space for both of them. They don't mix. The Führer principle was an attempt to mix those spaces and make Hitler the head of the church. There wasn't so much, on one hand, one might say that it wasn't so much that they wanted to hold their own power as much as they're being good Lutherans, and the two kingdoms must stay separate. The two realms must stay separate. That is a theological claim, a Lutheran theological claim. And the good Lutheran Nazi supporters wanted those spaces held separately. The steak with its juice doesn't touch the peas and carrots in the tray, in the TV tray. They keep their separate spaces. But they were supportive otherwise. Dietrich was not supportive of the Nazis. And he was more concerned than just the church-state separation. He was also concerned about the way that the Jews were being treated by this government. So beyond making the spaces separate, he also wanted to address the Aryan clause, the targeting of Jewish people. So that made him more radical than most. He was much more politically active. I should say that when he returned from Harlem, that summer of 31, he immediately writes a catechism with a Jewish friend, Franz Hildebrand. In that catechism, he says things like, the Christian only prays for peace, where before he would say, murder can be sanctified, war can be sanctified. Now he says, only peace. He also says that although the Christian might like to avoid politics, and I'm paraphrasing, the time will come when for the sake of loving your neighbor, you got to stand up, you got to get politically active. Think about the Scottsboro case. He says it right when he comes back. And 2 years later, he's writing in the Church and the Jewish Question about direct political action on behalf of people who are being targeted by the government. That is much more than the Lutheran separation of church and state. He's asking or claiming that the church must get political because the state is crushing people. So that's what's going on there with the distinction between him and his colleagues. He's like, I don't understand. These folks are much brighter than me, but they're totally inactive or unconcerned when it comes to the government's engagement with targeted people. What am I missing? He's like, so, and then the resolve that you were describing, I think it's also helpful to recognize he decided at age, really by age 13, he decided he was going to be a theologian. He's got he can stay focused on a topic. Undeterred. His family didn't think theology was something that would be worth the talents of such a brilliant kid. But he could be pretty focused. And he was pretty focused on this. That's one thing one might say is just a personality issue. But he's also not the only one in his family who is so focused like this. I could easily have written that book focusing on the relationship between he and Klaus, his older brother, one who's immediately older than him. Klaus hated the Nazis too. Klaus was dead set against the Nazis. Klaus thought that he wasn't going to survive the Nazis for his outspokenness against them, in opposition to them. And in fact, Klaus was also killed by the Nazis. Dietrich died on April 9th. Klaus was killed, shot in the back of the head by the Nazis in custody on April 23rd, along with their brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi. So his family was dead set against the Nazis as well. That's important to recognize.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't realize that those two were executed as well. And you said his family was not religious. So where did they find their grounding? Like what motivated them? What community? If Bonhoeffer had Harlem as part of what kind of motivated and inspired him, do you know where they got their inspiration?
From my estimation, a vision of Germany that did not include the Nazis. These were, interestingly, when the Nazis rose to power, initially their support was not from uneducated Germans. That came later, but their support was from the Bildungsbürgertum. But when you look at the resistors, especially the group around the Abwehr that Bonhoeffer was involved in, every one of those folks, over 100, were Bildungsbürgertum. People who felt it their duty to preserve and care for German culture and society. And the Nazis were decimating that, so far as Klaus could tell. He wrote a letter to Dietrich while Dietrich was in New York still, that if this movement continues to pick up a momentum, it'll be all over for this nation of intellectuals and poets. And Bonhoeffer, in his own regard, as a theologian, was seeking to preserve and restore German society as well, German culture and civilization, retrieving it from the teeth of the Nazis.
So maybe this would be a good tie in. I don't know if you are, my last question for you. I don't know if you're able and willing to comment on this, but I saw that you're working on a new book called The Bonhoeffer Conundrum.
Yeah.
Because what you just mentioned there at the end with, sure, religion and theology and Harlem were a big aspect of Bonhoeffer, but there were also these cultural aspects, and you even mentioned in the little blurb for it, it talks about how, what did it say? It said something to the extent of how Bonhoeffer was maintained some of the regime's ideologies, or he wrestled with those. Would you be willing to just talk briefly about that, about what you're focusing on for your book?
Sure. So on one hand, you've got this stalwart witness to the gospel in opposition to political evil. And as he describes in his theological project, Christ as the vicarious representation for us before each other and before God. We encounter God when we encounter our neighbor. With all of that. And it's very important as we acknowledge encountering God, that means that when we harm our neighbor in any way or in any way, form or fashion, you are, as it were, participating in the crucifixion with a hammer and nails. And that's just me embellishing that to some degree, but it has that resonance to it. This is just encapsulated here. I'm just do this in a nutshell here. But this Christ concrete in the world that we are to interact with for Bonhoeffer is also the unified West. For him, Christ is manifest as Europe and the United States, the very colonial structures that give us a racial narrative and a parentage, kind of first, third world engagement with the rest of the world. This is a very German, move it from the German-centric ideology of the Nazis, and it is a clear Western colonial holdover, with Christ as the representative of imperial presence, culture, and civilization.
So would you maybe say that that's maybe synonymous with like a paternalism of sorts?
No, yeah, that's that imperial paternalism.
Okay.
It is the same ideology that gives us that comes from the Berlin Conference, that gives us the scramble for Africa and the spread of civilization that the European powers are responsible for doing. That to recognize the presence, the physical manifestation on earth as Christ, is to turn Europe into a people-making process. Europe and the United States as the civilizing practice. Now, one might say he's just a man of his time when he's doing that. But, he's been to Harlem. He studied there. They would not be saying that. They were not saying that. In fact, they were arguing in opposition to the power and practices of colonialism that makes Africa subjects of Europeans.
Yeah. I know, coming from my community, where even back up until 2014 or 2015, where I struggled with with the violence with Michael Brown and Philando Castile and everything, it was really hard for me up until the 20 teens to see things differently outside of my white community, because in my heart, I wouldn't treat somebody that was different than me poorly. I didn't see or want to see the systemic violence that exists, which is indirect violence, that masked violence. And so I would imagine it's hard to think of Bonhoeffer as a bad colonialist type of guy, because he wants to save people. He doesn't want the treads of empire to run over the Jews that are in front of him. But he doesn't see the violence that is inherent in empire, on the fringes where it's harder to see, I guess.
Yeah, because it's easy to have racism be described as malevolence or hatred towards people who are less than you. But when you recognize that the claims of hierarchy include be nice to the people who are less than you, that the Nazis are eradicating and mean and awful, but those of us who are responsible for the maintenance of culture and civilization and parentage of the lesser civilizations and lesser people should be kind, not mean, is also white supremacy.
Yeah.
So you've got a complicated Christian engagement with fascism in Dietrich, where there's a lot to learn from him, but there's also a whole lot to confront him on.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end, because I did a whole season on propaganda, and one of the things that I learned is that when you have a simple narrative, it's usually propaganda, because there's complexity in everything, and when there's a single narrative, it's a controlled narrative. And to understand that Dietrich Bonhoeffer made some great choices, did some commendable things, but he was he was a human who dealt with sin as well. I think that's important.
Yep, very important.
Well, I appreciate your time. Is there anything you want to plug or anything else you want to add that you think was missed?
Well, I'd want to add that I have a documentary that I co-produced with a very dear German friend. It's called The Cloud of Witnesses. And it's a very helpful supplement to, people are willing to watch the movie, which they should, but to hear from German and US scholars, which I have some very, very good ones in the documentary, who are speaking in depth about and in detail. It's about an hour long, about Bonhoeffer's experience in Harlem and how it affected him. It's more than just me, although it's based on the research that I did, but these are scholars who are speaking their own voice, including Frank Fisher's grandson, who's a professor at Columbia University, the late Calvin Butts of Abyssinian Baptist Church, Ferdinand Schlingenzieper, co-founder of the International Dietrich Bonhoeffer Society, Professor Jutta Kozlowski, who is a German scholar who does a lot of work on Bonhoeffer's family, brilliant work. Alan Busak from South Africa. We got South African scholars, John DeGrucci and so forth, US scholars and German scholars. The documentary is called The Cloud of Witnesses.
And where can you access it?
Well, I'll send you a link. I'll send you a link. Right now, we're setting up the permanent streaming platform, but to get it at the moment is to contact my co-producer in Germany. He's the son of the co-founder of the Bonhoeffer Society.
Okay.
I'll send you.
That'd be great. Well, thank you again. I appreciate your valuable time, and it meant a lot and it helped a lot.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.